Hi, this is Ben CB for RaiseYourEdge.com, and today we will talk about the topic restealing. At first, I want to talk about typical mistakes which are committed constantly. We'll look together what we have to consider when we resteal, and we look when and how we should adapt and how we should construct our resteal ranges. As a separate point, we will look into resteal spots under 11 big blinds. That's a special topic because there are so many individual spots in dependence of our opponent. You will see that the ranges are too static, and this means that many players resteal always the same ranges or nearly the same ranges, and they don't adapt enough against the different player types. One reason is insufficient HUD, so many players don't look at the raise first in stats in UTG or in middle position, and that's often the reason why so many players play their standard ranges. Another important point is the consideration of the players behind us. If a fish or a regular is behind us, has enormous impacts on our resteal ranges, and the most players don't adjust their resteal ranges properly. The hand selection is also often insufficient, and it's common that Ace-X gets overplayed. We can say, in general, that most players resteal too loose against UTG and MP, but they resteal too tight with shorter stacks against UTG and MP. This may sound contradictory at first, but we will look into some examples later on. And often they defend too tight against loose racks, which are opening from late position. And now a little excursion. When we talk about restealing, we also want to talk about the passive defend, and I think that most players defend way too tight passive with 13 to 15 big blind stacks. Of course, restealing means rebetting or reshoving, but we can include the passive defense preflop also to make the one or another aggressive move on the flop. But in this video, we will mainly talk about rebetting and reshoving, and I will talk about the passive defend in other videos too. What we need to consider, we can resteal loser when regulars are behind, and when a fish is behind, we should resteal tighter cause they often overplay their hands. They call too loose, and that affects our resteal range tremendously, and the deeper the stacks, so more than 13 big blinds, the tighter we want to reship Ace-X offsuit hands. Of course, we have to look at it in dependence on the positions. Of course, there are many situations in which we can resteal Ace-Deuce offsuit against a cutoff or button open with 13, 14 or 15 big blinds, but overall we should pay attention that we don't make a mistake, and I think that most regulars resteal too light with Ace-X offsuit hands or the baby aces. We should pay attention that we want fold equity and okayish equity against the calling range of our opponent, and you will see that our equity with Ace-X hands is very bad against the calling range. We should use hands with better equity like 8-7 suited or Queen-Jack suited. Those hands are in general better to resteal with. Overplaying Ace-Queen or Pocket Nines is also very common, and this costs many players a lot of money. And with Ace, Queen and Pocket Nines type hands, I mean not only Ace, Queen and Pocket Nines specifically, rather medium strong hands like Ace Jack or Pocket Eights or even Pocket Tens. Or hands like Ace King when we overcall a resteal or the resteal from late position against early position. And many players see these hands as a no-brainer and think that this hand is always a resteal or always a call, and we will look into some example hands later on. And I see that they overplay their hands on the higher stakes very, very often. That's a huge leak, and I'm sure that the players at the low and mid stakes make less mistakes with those hands, cause some players on the higher stakes have a problem with their ego, and when they fold these hands, they think they get exploited or they have to battle with the other regulars. Some players think on the higher stakes everything is way looser, but that's not always the case, and that's the reason why those hands get overplayed. Another very important thing are the raise first in stats from every position and the fold to 3-bet stats from all positions. And it is important that you have these stats in your HUD. The resteal ranges are variable from 5 to 90% depending on our opponent, and you should try to understand that. It's similar to the open raising in my preflop course. I told you that your ranges should be very flexible, and you will hear this in a lot of video courses, cause this is an important part on the road to success. Now we look into different scenarios, and we want to look at first into restealing against other regulars. You should know that we should resteal against the fish mainly for value, especially 5 and 6-handed. 3-handed on the bubble or 4-handed with a chip lead. We can resteal a bit looser against the fish, but we want to look into the early game at first. All the hands have the 65-35 payout structure. Let's look in the first situation. We have 25 big blinds effective and a regular from UTG open raises with 15%. And now you see the different resteal ranges we can play against this open raising range. I put it also in the Hold'em resource calculator to show it to you. It is essential that we look at the different ranges in the Hold'em resource calculator, because I think so many players make huge mistakes, and sometimes it is very clear that a specific hand is just never a resteal, and on the first view it looks like a no-brainer shove, and there are some spots in which we can resteal very loose. I set his range to 15%, and this range is tight, but often found on all stakes. Don't be surprised that it is profitable for this player to open raise any two, cause we only look into the resteal scenario, so there's no cold calling and no bluff 3-bets, and we have only the direct reshoves, and these ranges are relatively tight. That's the reason why it is profitable for him to open any two, but in reality that's not the case. Let's start with middle position. Which hands can we resteal profitably? I adjusted the ranges manually and the overcall ranges. So when we reshove, these are the overcall ranges. You see that they are different. The small blind is a gamble fish, and we don't want to play a table only with regulars. When we have a second fish and he's calling 9s plus or king queen suited and ace queen offsuit, I think this is realistic, and we have 3 regulars which overcall with reasonable ranges. You will see that we should resteal very tight. As you can see, ace queen is burning money, and when we remove pocket 9s in the cold call range, then pocket 10s is also a marginal fold. We should flat call with those hands and resteal very, very tight. I see it very often that they shove ace queen offsuit in the spot, but this is never going to be profitable. The calling range from UTG against our resteal should be very tight. When we resteal this tight, even ace queen suited, ace king and pocket 10s should be a fold. When you raise in UTG and MP is a very good regular, you know that he has a good ICM understanding, or you know that he crushes the games, then you see what you lose when you call with ace king. Of course, it is possible that he 3-bets aces or flats aces. We have to include this also. Then we can call with ace king suited, and we should do this. Probably ace king offsuit also when he flats or 3-bets with aces, but there are racks shoving aces preflop too. This makes the difference if we can call ace king suited and ace king offsuit or not. But in this spot I see often a call with ace queen or pocket tens, and that's just burning money. Let's look into the cutoff now. So when we would sit on the cutoff, you can see there's not changing a ton. Pocket tens are marginal profitable now, but when we look into the overcall ranges, in the reality they are a bit looser. Then even pocket tens is not a profitable resteal anymore. We can resteal ace queen suited now profitably, but that's it. I made this range very loose, so this is the situation when we have a loose fish behind. When we have a good reg behind and he's overcalling with this range, so he's calling very tight and not too many things change for us. We have to fold pocket tens now, cause when the player's overcalling loose, he's calling pocket nines, but when he's tight, he's folding nines, and that's the right reason why we have to fold pocket tens then. Sometimes you have the Friday night gamble fish, and especially in the beginning of an sit and go, they want to gamble, then pocket tens is a profitable resteal. When you have a huge fish behind, it's a clear resteal, but on a normal table, this is just a fold. Now we look into the button and we can resteal around 6.7%, and you see that many hands are very marginal. When we remove these hands, king jack, ace jack, ace 4 and ace 5, then our range should be around 4%. Even ace queen offsuit on the button is not a clear reshove. I have one player that is overcalling a bit looser with pocket tens and ace queen. Then it should be clear that we have to resteal very tight. I want to show you the scenario when a regular on the button is restealing. We discount pocket aces, and which hands can we overcall in the blinds? You can see that even ace king and pocket jacks are not an overcall, so pay attention and not overplay those hands, otherwise you will burn so much money with that. And this is not a marginal spot. This will decrease your ROI by a lot. Many players think that it can't be that big of a mistake to get it in preflop with ace queen or ace king, but these spots occur very often and it's just burning money. I don't want to go through all situations with every stack size. Let's look at the small blind now, cause in this position we can resteal the one or another hand more. You can resteal one more hand, so we see that we can resteal pocket nines and also king jack suited, ace jack suited, and king queen offsuit. And in the big blind we can also steal a bit looser cause no one is behind us. But I think it is more profitable to flat call those hands cause these hands have a good playability and a good equity, and the odds are very good too. And I think he will call a bit looser when we resteal from the big blind. After that we can resteal that loose in the big blind. You see, when we just change the calling range a little bit, it has huge impacts on our resteal range. When we say he folds ace queen and pocket nines, then we can resteal loser, but when he's a bad reg, then we can't resteal the suited broadways. Here we've summarized the ranges from the cutoff. The 6% in brackets are all hands over 0%, but we don't want to use all the marginal spots, and you can see that the ranges from 3.3 to 5.13% are very tight. Now we look what happens when UTG open raises a 20% range. When you are not sure if you should flat call or resteal, then make this dependent on your post-flop reads. When you have a notorious c-better, then you should resteal, cause you will not realize your equity that often. And when you are in position, it is an option to flat aces and kings. That's always a good adaptation against players which c-bet extremely wide. So when you have a close spot, make the decision based on your post-flop reads. I have prepared some ranges in the Hold'em resources calculator. I gave him a 20% open raising range in Under the Gun. When we look into middle position now, we see even against the 20% range, pocket tens and ace queen are close. Sure, it's not burning money anymore, but we should avoid these spots and flat call. I would also flat call ace queen suited. You keep also the potential fish behind you in the pot when they want to overcall queen 10 or ace deuce offsuit. So we keep them in the pot and gain a higher EV with this play. You should memorize to invite the fish in the pot, and you can see that we don't print a lot of money when we resteal pocket tens and ace queen. I think that he's calling this range against a resteal. There are players which call pocket nines and there are players which fold ace queen. When we remove aces, we can call jacks plus and ace king, and I think that's a solid range against a good regular. When you have the read that he 3-bets queens, kings and aces, then we can call with pocket tens. So it is always good to have the one or another read how trappy he is. There are players which flat call a wide range to induce a squeeze shove. I think this is also okay, but this depends on how many players are behind. When there are sick maniacs behind, we should flat call our entire range, I think. When we exclude the marginal hands, we have a tight resteal range of 3.7%. Even on the cutoff, we have only a 5.1% resteal range. When we think a player behind can overcall a little bit looser, this does not make a big difference in our resteal range. Let's look into the button now. We can see that we can resteal a bit looser in this position with 8.6%, but when we remove king queen and ace jack and all the small pockets, then we have a 5-6% range. When you have a weaker regular in Under the Gun that has not much knowledge about resteal ranges or ICM, then you shouldn't resteal too loose, cause break even or slightly losing regs have often ICM problems and think ace queen offsuit is an easy raise call. When you have a good regular, you can exploit him a little bit. When he raise folds ace queen offsuit in Under the Gun, we can resteal a wider range. The 12 combinations of ace queen have a huge impact on our resteal range, so we can resteal 15% or 13 to 14% when we fold the marginal hands. And we can see that ace queen gets profitable in the blinds when the button resteals that loose. And we do this to get a better understanding of this situation. I think that you want to play with many bad players at your table, and we have to include that they can call with ace queen, and then our button range gets tighter, as you can see. Let's talk a little bit about overcall probabilities. When we have a fish behind, I think he can call this range, and we should resteal just for value, so pocket eights and ace queen plus. And we should fold our semi bluffs like the suited aces or small pockets. But hands like king queen suited or queen jack suited are in position nearly all the time a flat call and not a resteal. I think there's no scenario when I want to resteal instead of flat call in position and play post flop. And with our call, we invite the fish in the small blind or big blind also to come along. I think with these two examples, you can see that players make a mistake with ace king when they overcall. So Under the Gun open raises, middle position resteals, then we have very often a fold with ace king. Okay, let's see. Under the Gun open raises and the cutoff resteals. We can never call ace king on the button in the small blind or in the big blind. Even jacks are minus EV. When we discount aces, we can call pocket jacks, and I think we should call with pocket jacks, but we should fold ace king on the button. And I summarized this spot also. So when a regular open raises 20% in under the gun, you should resteal roughly those ranges. Especially the small blind is extremely dependent how the big blind overcalls. We can resteal a bit looser from the small blind when the big blind is a solid regular, which is overcalling very tight. Then the small blind range increases, and I think the big blind resteal range of 9% is very solid. I want to show you very quick this spot for the big blind. When we are confronted with an UTG raise, it is possible that we can resteal very loose. When we see what he is calling against our resteal, I think this range is very loose. And I think it's more like this range. And then we can resteal way looser than 9%. Against an average rack with a 20% UTG range, we should resteal very wide, especially hands like Ace Jack offsuit, King Jack offsuit, Queen 10 suited, cause we are out of position. Flat calling is also okay, but as you can see, the shove EV is very high, and we should resteal hands like King Deuce suited. When you think about calling, you should flat hands like Jack 10 suited, but I think he's calling this range against a reshove, cause the most players resteal very tight against under the gun. Cause no one is behind, we get more credit for our resteal than when we reshove from the small blind, cause we are last to act and we can flat a lot of hands, and when we flat in the small blind, we are often three-handed and out of position. And when we call in the big blind, we always have position on the small blind. As I told you, you should resteal looser than 9% against a 20% under the gun range when a good regular is open raising. And that's what I told you in the beginning, that many players resteal too loose from middle position or the cutoff against under the gun, and in the big blind most players don't resteal enough. Now let's move on to another situation. A rack with 25 big blinds is open raising a 25% range in under the gun. And this is not a rare situation. This happens once in a while. And we have to resteal very tight in middle position. We can't adapt huge in middle position, but we can resteal hands like 10s and ace queen now. You can see it in the calculator also that those hands are plus EV now, cause we win so often the dead money. And you can see that our ranges get looser on the cutoff, the button, and the small blind, and of course in the big blind. Especially in the big blind, we should resteal extremely wide against those opponents. We can resteal looser in the small blind too, but I selected the worst case for the small blind, so that the player is overcalling very loose. But when we change the overcalling range to a tight overcalling range, then we see that we can resteal looser from the small blind. I think the calling range from UTG is okay. I think most players fold Ace Jack suited even when he is open raising that loose. And that's what I've talked about in my previous course, that many players have a high raise fold gap. So they raise, but they are not well balanced against the resteal. And we can attack this league. You can see that we can reshove from the small blind a 22% range. When we fold the marginal hands, I think then we have a 16-17% range. In the big blind we can resteal even more hands. I would not be surprised when we can resteal any two. So when under the gun raises more than 22-23%, we should resteal very loose from the small blind and from the big blind. When you see that under the gun makes the one or another loose call against our resteal, then we should resteal tighter, but it's still a loose resteal range. And when he's calling tight, we should resteal very loose. With 10-4 suited, just close your eyes and hit the push button. We have 0.3, so it's so profitable. Even 3 deuce suited is very profitable. Just fold the crap hands. He's calling your shove so rarely. every 5th time, so it takes a while to get called. And in this spot we only consider hands that have an $EV of 0.1 or more, so I included the edge already. And I want to talk about this sentence. Yeah, but I can't resteal solos against Under the Gun. He will adapt against me. And I hear this for other spots also. Just resteal loose against them until they start to adapt. You shouldn't resteal a 100% range. So give them the feeling that you can fold and you're not exploiting them all the time. And the most regulars are too lazy to take notes. Even when you resteal Jack 4 suited against Under the Gun and you get called, don't resteal ultra tight the next time you play against this opponent. Just play your loose ranges until he calls very loose against your push. There are a ton of regulars which never write any notes cause they are just too lazy, and when you adapt you lose money cause you skip this spot all the time. Otherwise, when he calls, you just lose a little bit with his loose call, but you adapt and resteal tighter in the future, and you win your money back cause he's calling loose against your pushes, but your resteal range is now really tight. But when you resteal loose and he calls you with a strong hand and you adapt right away, you just leave money on the table cause you don't know if he has adapted. So don't think that everyone plays perfect and writes notes. That's usually not the case. Even on the higher limits are players which doesn't care about writing notes. And sometimes when we play those loose ranges, we will get called and it looks like we're a donkey, but it is profitable and another way to get successful. Now we look into some situations with 15 big blinds. Again, we play against the 15% under the gun range, 20% under the gun range, and after that we will look into situations against the button. Of course, the blind stage is 15-30. I set the stack sizes a bit dynamic, so under the gun to the button have 15 big blinds, and the small blind and the big blind have 20 big blinds, so 600 chips. You can see that the ranges are not that tight, like when we want to resteal against a 25 big blind stack. That's why our risk reward ratio gets better. We can look into it for a middle position. When UTG open raises 15%, we can resteal 6.6%. I wrote down 5.4% cause I don't want to resteal the marginal hands. And with that we have 5.4% and we can resteal Ace Queen plus, Pocket Nines plus, and King Queen suited. That's with the assumption when only Rex are behind us. When we put a loose fish into our calculation, then we should fold King Queen suited, but basically it's the same range, especially hands like King Queen, King X suited, Jack 10 suited. When you sit on the cutoff or button and you resteal against Under the Gun, it is so important to look if a very loose maniac is behind you, cause then we have to fold those hands. The problem is that the maniac will call hands like A7 suited or pocket sixes, and we don't want to flip for our stack. And with every position we can resteal a bit looser, and in the big blind it is possible to resteal very loose, even against his 15% under the gun range. Cause when we look at his calling range, it looks realistic. Cause on his point of view, we resteal against under the gun, and then you can resteal way looser than the 16.4%. When we fold all marginal hands, we can resteal around 25%. So any suited ace, any pocket pair, any suited Broadway, all offsuit Broadways, and hands like Jack 8 suited, Queen 8 suited, till King 4 suited, and I think this range is reasonable, and you can resteal that loose. Against the 20% under the gun range, it is often the case that most players resteal in middle position or the cutoff too tight against under the gun. we can resteal relative loose, and when we look in the Hold'em resource calculator, we can see that hands like King Queen and King Jack suited are very good reshove hands. And then 8s plus, and we have around 10% range when we fold all the marginal hands. And I included lighter overcalls with hands like Ace-10 suited or pocket sixes for the big blind. When you have a table with only regulars behind that overcall very solid, then you can resteal lighter in middle position. Then you can resteal the suited wheel aces, Ace-9 suited plus, all suited broadways, Ace-Jack offsuit, King Queen offsuit, and pocket fives plus. And that's why it is important to look which players are behind us. When you have a tough table, we have regardless the option to gain a little edge. The advantage on this table is that we can estimate the ranges very good. We can set the open raising ranges exactly, and we can set the overcall ranges. And in early position, middle position, and the cutoff, it is often the same calling range. And we can find some spots in which we can resteal lighter than normal. Now you may ask yourself, there are some racks which open shove 15 big blinds. When we assume now that he is open shoving some hands, but many people also shove raise call hands, so hands like aces or ace king. So when we remove those hands and put them in the shoving range, you see that we can resteal loser, and there are racks which open shove ace king in under the gun all the time, cause they don't want to play post flop. But there are also racks which open raise the hand and then call the push. As you can see, the resteal range changed not too much, but this is something you can do against different player types with your notes and reads on your limit, that you play a little bit with these ranges, then you get a good feeling very fast for this spot. The range is similar on the cutoff, around 10%, and I think this is reasonable. And I think the overcalls are reasonable too. We have 2 loose overcalls in the blinds. Let's assume now there is a maniac in the blinds. Then we should resteal around 8% instead of 10%. And as you know, we should remove the marginal hands. Maybe it's just 7%. When we get to the button, it gets more interesting, because very often we have only racks behind which overcall this range when we reshove against another gun, because they don't expect us to reshove very loose. When we look at another gun and he calls the resteal too light, when his calling range is tighter, then we can resteal from the button and the blinds very loose, because 20% is way too loose for the stack size, and we can exploit this very hard, and we should do this. When you see that there are 2 racks in the blinds, we should reshove very light, but pay attention to the ace-x offsuit hands. We should resteal ace-10 offsuit and ace-deuce suited plus, and you will have the spot very often. So that you can resteal ace-deuce suited plus, but only ace-10 offsuit plus. But in this spot we can shove king-10 offsuit, queen-10 offsuit, 10-8 suited, and 10-9 suited. These hands are a clear resteal against a 20% under the gun range. You can look also at the photo 3-bet stat in under the gun, cause when this stat is very low, you should resteal a bit tighter. So maybe he's open shoving ace-10, ace-jack, or all hands he has to raise fold, and those hands are close Nash shoves. And maybe all the suited aces and the pocket pairs and ace-jack suited. When he min raises this range, we should resteal very tight. So when he only has a fold to 3-bet stat of 20-30%, we should resteal very tight, because most of the time he will call our resteal. And that's why it is important to look at the fold to 3-bet stat. When you don't know which stats you should include in your HUD, I suggest you the course optimal HUD and node system. Now we look into this spot for the small blind, and you can suspect that we can resteal very loose in this position. We should assume that under the gun doesn't call our resteal very loose, and then we can resteal very wide, as you can see. And we should resteal this range, cause 20% is way too loose for the stack size. And there are racks which raise even lighter with the stack size, especially racks from the MTT scene, cause they think they can steal lighter, and in theory we can resteal any two from the big blind. Let's assume he's calling 7s plus, so we should resteal 90%. The thing is that under the gun will assume that resteal tight, and I don't think that he's calling loser. The one or another braindead rack will call loser, and even with this range we can resteal very loose. So use this spot and don't resteal too tight, and that's the point I talked about earlier. Most racks steal way too tight in this situation, but they resteal the wrong hands in the early game with the ace queen and pocket nines type hands. It is important that you filter the stats, and you should set your tracking program up for 21 to 30 big blinds, for 15 to 20 big blinds, and for 10 to 14 big blinds, and 7 to 9 big blinds. Especially the 10 to 30 big blind part is extremely important. Under 9 big blinds, most players play the Nash ranges, so it is not that important. You can also choose 1 to 6 big blinds and 7 to 9 big blinds. But the first 3 stages are really important. You can also make it from 7 to 11 big blinds, and from 12 to 13, from 16 to 21, and from 22 to 30 big blinds. And you should filter for the number of players. 5 and 6-handed is usually the same dynamic, and that's why we can summarize it. And we have a higher sample size with this. And then separated 4-handed, 3-handed, and heads up. When you have no sample size, then just by hands. Nowadays this is really important. Only a few players can play without stats, or just with very few stats, cause they are a sick crusher post flop on ICM, so they make very few mistakes. But I think exceptions are not the rule, and I think those players could increase their win rate when they would use stats. I have now a scenario for the button. So when the button is the razor, I choose 20 big blinds as a stack size, and you can see our resteal frequencies, and you can see we can exploit the loose button ranges very good. I don't think most players resteal enough. When you are in the small blind, it is important to look at the player in the big blind. Against the fish we should resteal tight, and against the rack we can resteal looser than these numbers. I chose the following stack constellations. So we have the highest bubble factors on this table, but nevertheless we can resteal very loose. Then I want to talk about if we should 3-bet small in the small blind, or if we should flat call. Those are also possibilities when we have 20 big blinds that we 3-bet small. Let's assume we have 400 chips at 10-20, then we can 3-bet fold to 90 or 100. And we should make this dependent on the big blind. Is he aggressive? We should flat less hands and reshove more hands ourselves. If he is passive, he will overcall our small 3-bet more often, and we are out of position 3-handed in a very tough spot. And in general, when he is a huge fish, we should overcall a hand like Queen Jack suited, cause he is capable of overcalling the shove with Ace 5 or King Jack suited, and we don't want that. And the hand is strong enough to play post flop, so don't play your standard ranges all the time. And look at the button. Maybe he is very passive, or he folds a lot to check raises or to donk bets. Then you are able to flat more hands. And when he's more aggressive, you should reshove more hands. But as I told you, tendentially we should rejam in the small blind, cause the big blind can overcall or squeeze and it's harder to realize our equity. But there are some exceptions. When the big blind is a huge fish, we can flat call some hands, or when the button is very passive that you know how to adapt. And the same applies to the big blind. In this spot we only need to look how the button is playing. If he is post-flop very passive, we should flat call hands like ace-5 suited, ace-8 suited, cause we get to the showdown very often. And we can move him off his hand post-flop sometimes. Most of the time it is profitable to ship these hands 20, 18, 17 big blinds deep, but there are situations in which the players are very passive and c-bet very rarely and they fold a lot to donks. We should use those spots cause this is way more profitable, and it's important that you don't use the same line all the time. Always ask yourself, is there another way to play this hand? Now we have the situation when we are four-handed or on the bubble. As a mid stack or big stack, we should resteal very tight against other big stacks. We have an extra ICM charge of 10% when we play against other big stacks, but there are racks which abuse their chip lead too loose, and we should back play against them and rejam loose because their raise fold gap is just too wide. When we are four-handed, it is also important to include our future EV. When we can overtake the chip lead, this justifies often a break even or slightly minus EV rejam. But it is also okay to skip slightly plus EV spots to protect our big stack, to not risk our big stack, cause we will get many clear plus EV spots in the next orbit, or when the table is very soft, so on your left is a huge passive fish and a tight regular. Often I get asked, how do I know if this regular is tight? When you never saw a loose call from this regular in the last 2k hands, then it is possible that he's calling very tight. So you have for sure regulars which call very loose sometimes, and you should note when a regular calls according to Nash, because many regulars, especially at the mid and low stakes, doesn't call according to Nash. And that's often the difference between a high stakes and a mid stakes rack, that the mid stakes rack is not calling loose enough. So write down when you see that your opponent is calling with the bottom end of the Nash range. But when you have a regular and after 1 or 2k hands you don't have the note on him that you saw him call with the bottom end of the Nash range, then you should adapt and push loser against him. When you have a tight rack on your side that pushes very tight and you have a close call but you have 2 spots on the table, then just skip this slightly plus EV spot. It is important on the bubble that you always take your opponent's stats and reads into account. Many players play different on the bubble. Some players just go crazy when they have the chip lead. Some players are too tight, some play the bubble very solid, and against very aggressive racks we should resteal a lot. Then there are racks which open shove a lot and trap many hands, so we should resteal very tight against them. And there are racks which are capable of folding with 8 or 9 big blinds. This is a profitable play, and I want to talk about this play in my course also. And we can resteal very light against them, cause the risk reward ratio is so good, because we only risk 8 or 9 big blinds and we can take down a nice pot. But you should only do this when you know that he is capable of folding. Many players do this with a very unbalanced range, cause when they do it with aces and kings, they have less combos than, let's say, king deuce offsuit and queen 7 offsuit, and we get so many folds and our non-showdown winnings just skyrocket. Of course, we will shove into aces sometimes, but it is important to note that he can raise fold with the stack size. But I think this is important on the $60 or $100 stakes. On the lower stakes, I think they do it more often as a trap, so from $1 to $60. Now we look into some example hands, in the first hand we have pocket sixes in the big blind. The button is a loose rack. I just want to talk quick about my HUD cause I added some stats. The second line are the raise first in stats and the last line are the fold to 3-bet stats. And you can see that he raises very loose from the button, 62%. That's too loose and we can exploit this very easy and we have a clear reshove. But when he raises 62% from the button, we assume this is his calling range. When he don't know that we resteal super light, that's a very loose calling range. I think he will fold pocket fours, ace-8 offsuit and ace-7 suited. And even against this range we can reshove very wide. So we should reshove very wide cause otherwise he exploits us with his steals. And hence like 10-9 suited are too profitable to reshove, so don't flat too many hands. When the ranges from your opponent are that loose, it is hard to earn more money with flatting. I think the flat will be profitable too, but the shove is more profitable and we should reshove also hands like king queen suited, king 10 suited. To gain that post flop edge, he has to be a very bad player with many huge post flop leaks. Even if we think that he is calling loser, we can reshove very wide. And at first I would resteal 80 to 90% instead of this range, because I think most players will call tighter against the resteal. Let's move on to the next hand. The cutoff raises and he raises 35%, the third stat in the second line, so somewhat loose. You can open raise this range, but with aggressive racks behind you should not open raise this range. But as a default it's okay, we can reshove very wide against this range. I gave him the 35% cutoff range and this calling range. I think it's a solid range. He can think that we will 3-bet aces, kings, queens, and that's why he can call with pocket fives. And you can see that we can again reshove very wide. 8-5 suited is profitable too. Even if he's calling loser, then the shove is break even, and we shove against the cutoff, so most players don't call that light. So in the worst case, the shove is break even, and in the best case, it's super profitable. And with normal ranges, we make a good profit. And I'm always looking what is the best case, what's the worst case, and what is standard. When the spot is marginal in the best case, then I skip the spot, or under normal circumstances, the spot is marginal and it's only profitable in the best case scenario, then I skip it too. But in this case, under normal assumptions, it's profitable, and in the worst case, the reshove is break even, then we have a clear reshove. We reshove, but we get called and he shows us ace king. Of course, this happens. Next hand, regular in under the gun open raises, and we have to think if we want to reshove. He has a 24% open raising range in under the gun. And when you think back on the foil from earlier, we can resteal very loose. So this is the 24% UTG range, and we reshove in the small blind. I think this overcall range is okay. I don't know anything about this player. Let's look at the UTG calling range, but I think we should modify it a little bit and remove those hands. And then we can reshove very wide. With king 9 suited we have a very profitable reshove. And I remember this hand cause he tank called pocket nines. So when you resteal against under the gun, most people are really tight, and we can exploit that. We get lucky on the turn and we win. Let's move on to the next hand, regular open raised in under the gun. And you can see in the second line that he has huge leaks. The distribution in under the gun, middle position and cutoff is very bad. He will burn so much money, and with 2,600 hands, there's not so much variance. He just raises too loose in early and middle position. Now let's look into the calculator when we give him a 30% raise first in range. As you can see, we can resteal very light against him. I also included the overcall probability of 10% in the small blind, and the cutoff is also a loose overcaller, and I think this is the worst case. So when we make the range a bit tighter, we can still resteal a lot. This is the calling range against the resteal, and I think this range is just bad. Of course, when he open raises that loose, he has to call more, otherwise he's folding too much and the gap gets too high. But that's a problem when you open raise so much, because you have to raise calls so many hands. I think the range itself is okay, but I would never call so much hands against the reshove in under the gun. That's the problem, we just shouldn't open raise so much in under the gun. And you can see that we can still resteal a lot in this position. Even hands like 10-9 suited, ace-2 suited, or pocket deuces. And we have tight players behind, as you can see. When we give him just a 5% overcall probability and him also, then we can shove hands like Jack 10, Queen 10, and King 10. Even hands like King 3 suited, Queen 8 suited, up to 7-8 suited. We shove and he folds. And these are typical spots against loose racks in middle position or on the cutoff that most players resteal too tight with these stack sizes. Let's move on to the next hand. We have a regular with just 70 hands and he raises from under the gun. But as I told you, the stats are filtered, and I had in mind that he raises very loose with deeper stacks even in under the gun. And we can see it in the first 70 hands also, that he's very loose in under the gun. And that's why I decided to resteal here. What I wanted to show you, we have one stack that we don't want to stack off against, and therefore I decided to 3-bet small. And so we can fold against the button, and I would 3-bet my entire range with this sizing. And we win the hand. We have to call against under the gun when he shoves, cause the odds are too good. That's a good play to decrease the variance and to increase your ROI, to not get it in against other big stacks. Against the blinds it is close, cause I think they will only ship queens plus and maybe ace king. And we are crushed against this range. We have to calculate it and add the ICM extra charge to see if we can fold here. That's option 2. When we have a hand like king 9 or king 10 offsuit or ace deuce offsuit, I think we can fold against a shove, but with king 9 suited, I think the odds are a little bit too good to fold. I wouldn't resteal too loose in this position, cause the button is an unknown for me, but he looks loose and aggressive. Maybe he's overcalling the one or another hand loser than a regular, but I think I'm restealing 20 to 30% in this spot. There are racks which play very good and tight and balanced ranges, and we can't resteal that many hands against them. We can only resteal from 5 to 10%, so your overall 3-bet stat will be very normal. You don't have to be afraid that you get exploited. It is just important that you know that you can resteal very loose and very tight, and on a higher sample size you will have a normal 3-bet stat in all positions. It is just very hard to play against you, so you will not have any leaks in your 3-bet stat, so you don't have to be afraid of getting exploited. Let's move on to the next hand. We have a regular in under the gun, and he open raises way too loose with 27%. That's very good to exploit, and I decided to just reshove, cause I remember that I 3-bet some hands before and I just don't want to fold against him. I want to punish him for his loose open raise ranges. The blinds are 2 racks and the button was unknown. I wouldn't resteal too loose cause the button looks aggressive and maybe he's overcalling a bit looser. But when we look at it, so Under the Gun raises with 27% and I gave the button a looser overcalling range. And I think the regs are overcalling with this range, but I think the ranges are too loose. Ace Queen and Pocket Tens are against normal ranges, not an overcall. Then we can reshove very wide. When the button is irregular in this scenario, we can resteal very wide. You can see that Ace6 suited is very profitable now, and before we had an EV of 0.16, and I take every edge over 0.1. But as in default, I would 3-bet fold here. I think this is more profitable, but I decided to reshove given the table dynamic. And it gets through. Especially in this position, you will get so much credit. I think that it is possible that he folds Ace Queen, because most of the time they resteal 10s plus or 9s plus, Ace Queen plus. And with Ace Queen, he has a clear fold against this range. And most players flat call hands like King Queen, King Jack suited. The same player open raises from the hijack and he raises nearly 30% on the hijack, and I think that this hand is a clear reshove. We can resteal around 30% I think. Let's move on to the last hand. We have the situation that we are in the small blind and the reg raises 50%. On the first 33 hands we can see that in the big blind is a huge fish and he looks very passive. A resteal is profitable and he can overcall a lot. Hands like King 10 suited, King Queen suited, King Queen offsuit or Ace 10 offsuit. And I think the reshove is still profitable, but I think that the call has a higher EV. When we look at this spot in the calculator, we see when the button raises 50% and the big blind is overcalling with a 10% range. The regular knows that I will 3-bet aces and kings small, or even queens, jacks and 10s. I think he can call this range against our reshove, but our reshove is still very profitable. We are out of position post flop and it is not that easy to gain more EV with a call, and I think in hindsight I should have just shoved. When we sit on the button and the cutoff raises, then I would flat, cause we have position on both players. He squeezes and we have to fold. Let's look at a few important points when we have less than 11 big blinds. When we have a hand to call a push and villain raises with 10 or 9 big blinds and we don't know what to do. At lower stakes it is very often a trap and the ranges are in general stronger, and we should resteal tighter in this case. When Ace 8 offsuit is the bottom calling range, then I think we can even fold this hand against those min raise ranges. On the $60 plus stakes, the ranges are more balanced and we shouldn't hero fold any hands. We should just play our standard resteal range. We resteal the exact same range which we would call against a shove, and then we look if he is raise folding or raise calling. There are many players which fold a lot cause they just try to wrap aces and kings and they have a very unbalanced raise fold range and they raise fold a ton, and when we fold very tight we just lose money. The next time we have to adapt and we have to see if he raise folds a lot or if he shows us the second time aces or kings again. When he only folds 10 or 20% to 3-bets with this stack size, we can start making really sick exploits. We can fold hands against his range that we would have called against his push, and then we should call loser against his pushes, cause his shoving range is capped. I also talk about this topic in my video course Optimal Pushes, and we start to resteal step by step a bit tighter, but don't make sick hero folds on the lower stakes. You can make small adaptations on these stakes, but I think there's a difference if you play the $30, $15 or $7 stakes. Just play your standard ranges and don't make rash closures. When you see that he can fold or that he has aces and kings all the time, it is important that you note that and adapt the next time. Now we are nearly at the end. I want to talk about a few general points when we talk about restealing. Analyzing resteal ranges and push and call ranges are your daily homework. I can show you some basic elements, but it is important that you train that by yourself, and not only 2 or 3 weeks. This should be on your daily training, cause there are over 1,000 different scenarios, different stack sizes, different opponents, positions, bubble factors, and you can just learn it when you look at the specific ranges, and then you will get a better feeling for these spots. In the first course about open raising, you will develop a solid understanding of it, but with the push or fold ranges, it is different. When you had a 2-week vacation and you're back on the grind, you realize that you're a bit rusty with your resteal ranges. When you should c-bet and when you should open raise, we have a good universality to use it, and you will keep this knowledge long term. I like the comparison when we train resteal and push ranges to a soccer player which makes his daily pass exercises. Even a Cristiano Ronaldo starts with pass exercises in the training to stay fit, and this is the case for every soccer player. With this, you don't lose your feelings to the technique. Okay, Cristiano Ronaldo is maybe not the perfect example. I think he can pause 1 year and still be one of the best, but I think you get the point. And you develop further and get better, and therefore you can play more tables or you can focus on tougher spots and you have more time for them. Cause when a soccer player needs a long time to take on the ball, he needs the technique, then another player will take away the ball when he's too slow. And I think the same applies to the poker player. We can see the similarities to a lot of sports, and you should be aware of that. When you need to take a lot of time to make your decisions, you will burn a lot of money. As a result, you will time out quite frequently, and you won't have the time to make correct decisions in the really tough spots. You get more self-confidence at the tables when you develop a good feeling for the different spots. No sit-and-go player in the world knows all the ranges from memory. Everyone does mistakes, even the best sit-and-goer or the sickest crusher. Everyone makes mistakes in the one or another spot. It's all about minimizing the mistakes, and in the end, the player with less mistakes will win. Depending on how fit you are with ICM, so pushing, calling, restealing, you should train 10 to 15 hands. So 5 resteal spots, 5 push spots, and 5 call spots. You should analyze before a session with an ICM program. It can be a marked hand or just a random hand from the last session. And then you look how you would play certain ranges. And your hand can be a clear push, but what's the bottom end of your shoving or of your calling range? Or look if there's a alternative line against this opponent. That's why I don't say just learn the stuff for 1 or 2 weeks. I mean, you can do it when you realize that you have huge leaks in this part of your game. You can concentrate on this and train, but after this you should train it every day to not get rusty, and it takes not a lot of time and you don't need hours for it. It should take 10, 15, 20 minutes, I think. And with that, you are always up to date. I hope you could learn a lot. This video is quite long. I wish you success in these spots, that you can exploit your opponents at the maximum. And this was Ben CB for RaiseYourEdge.com. Bye bye.